Okay. George, are you there?
John, hi. Welcome
Hey.
back.
Yeah. Nice to hear you again. So it's been 2 weeks since our last appearance on Blogging Heads.
Yeah, you were in the Caribbean?
Yes. You know, actually, I was trying to get away from science down there, but it followed me to an extent. I was on a trimaran with my family cruising to this island off St. Croix, and we went by this old stone house on a promontory. It was really cool looking. And the guy, our pilot, mentioned that a famous scientist had once stayed there, Robert Oppenheimer.
Really?
So that was pretty cool.
That's great.
So,
he's an old New Mexico boy, and so we run into Robert Oppenheimer references out here all the time, since his family had a ranch near Santa Fe, and then, of course, when he started the Manhattan Project, that was up at the boys' school in Los Alamos, where he had once been a student.
Yeah. Well, Robert Oppenheimer is also a character in a biography of Einstein that I guess we both just reviewed.
Oh yeah, there were two of them, right? One by Walter Isaacson, who's a long-time Time Inc. political guy, and by a German,
Jürgen Neffe, I guess it's pronounced. So you reviewed both of those books too.
Yeah, that's funny. I guess these are the hot science books right now.
Yeah. So which one did you like better?
I was surprised. I was actually asked to review the Isaacson, and then just it would be nice to mention that there's this other book by this Jürgen Neffe, which actually came out a year before in Germany and was translated. And usually when you pick up a book that's been translated into English, especially nonfiction, it's I expected it not to be very good, but I was really wrong. It's just I found it just beautifully written and just gripping language. The translator must just be a really great writer herself, or just have a real sense of language that I thought made the book come alive for me in more than Isaacson's, although I thought Isaacson's was really a good, solid biography.
I thought they were both pretty good. I was worried that it was going to be a lot more about Einstein than I wanted to know, and I've already read so much about Einstein even before reading these two biographies. But it was more than 1,000 pages, which was pretty tough sledding at times. But I don't know, the life of Einstein just never ceases to fascinate. Yeah. Was there anything that you learned from the books that really surprised you?
Oh, I already knew the Einstein in Love stuff from reading Dennis Overby's book called Einstein in Love,
which is a great book too.
Oh yeah, that was really good. He really broke the ground on this kind of unsanitized version of the Einstein.
Yeah, his sexual shenanigans.
Right. Yeah,
actually, Neffe had a good line, and I thought one of the differences between Isaacson and Neffe is that Neffe was a little less reverential toward Einstein and Isaacson. So Neffe quoted somebody saying about Einstein that he loved sweaty, smelly women, and the sweatier and smellier the better.
Oh, God, I forgot that line. Yeah.
I highlighted it.
Yeah, he was an interesting guy, and Einstein. The image that was left of, I think it was from Isaacson's book, of Einstein smoking cigars and drinking coffee while he's up all night trying to figure out the general theory of relativity.
Yeah.
That was a great image. I guess what I learned was mostly from Neffe's book, instead of doing a straight chronological, start with, Grandpa and Grandma Einstein, coming, down the village road in the cart, or however these biographies usually start, he does these oblique cuts kind of through Einstein's timeline almost, and like one chapter on Einstein and women, or another one on why Einstein had to discover relativity, how just all these currents came together in his life, and all the precursors. So I guess that was one thing I appreciated more that I hadn't. I knew that there were other scientists like Henry Poincaré that anticipated many things about relativity, and yet it was just fascinating to find, going back to Einstein's childhood books, that some of the things like his famous fantasy of writing on the back of a light beam was actually sort of suggested possibly by one of these childhood science books that he read.
Yeah, that was really interesting. You know, another part that I really enjoyed was when they described this quixotic quest to find a unified theory of physics in the last few decades of his life. I knew that he'd done that, but I'd never really read anything about it in detail. And both books said that he would periodically claim that he had found the unified theory, and the New York Times and other publications would dutifully announce this and say, Einstein has discovered another new theory that goes beyond relativity and quantum mechanics. And
the headlines are wonderful.
Yeah. And I mean, you know, if Einstein says he's discovered a theory like this, you have to believe him, right?
Well, yeah. It was like our dilemma the other week with superstring theory.
That's right.
Some of these headlines in the New York Times were just really, really funny.
Yeah.
Well,
so I hadn't realized that he actually got quite a bit of attention during that latter part of his career for this thing he was trying to do, unify relativity and quantum mechanics. And so he would announce that he'd succeeded, and then I guess he would say, oops, maybe not, never mind. And then a few years later, he'd have another announcement he'd think he'd found it this time. And I'm not sure. I guess at some point, either he stopped making this claim or the New York Times stopped printing it.
Yeah, the boy crying wolf.
Yeah.
I think Isaacson was particularly good on that, and I mean, I could see what Einstein, it really came across in the books why he wanted to do this, because the great thing about the general theory of relativity, this is like his theory of gravity, of course, and basically before gravity had been this mysterious action at a distance that no one understood, and it was almost spooky and mystical. Spooky action at a distance was gravity. And then Einstein showed that gravity actually comes out of the curvature of three-dimensional space, or four-dimensional space and time. And then, as I understand it, he was trying to add a dimension to that. So maybe if you go to 5 dimensions, you can curve that in some way that you not only get gravity coming out of it, but you get this other force, electromagnetism, and then everything is reduced to one law.
Right. So here we are in 2007, still looking for this unified theory that Einstein failed to find.
Yeah, this was, I just found one of those headlines. This was from January 25th, 1929. Einstein reduces all physics to one law. And then, there are all these deck of New York Times subheads, going down, and the one near the bottom says, "Hypothesis opens visions of persons able to float in air," says NYU professor.
If only it were so.
Yeah, and as you say, now we're, how many, 77 years later, and still looking.
Yeah. One question I wish that the biographies had taken on, it's this one that people, the physicists, love to chew over. I wrote an essay with this theme for the New York Times last year. Will there ever be another Einstein? Will there ever be anybody in physics or anywhere in science with that kind of almost supernatural stature?
Yeah.
I concluded that there won't. That somehow Einstein was the perfect person at the perfect time. I mean, it was these qualities of his that are really difficult to match, but also he happened to come along at a point in the history of science when there were these huge discoveries still waiting to be made.
Yeah. And
my argument, of course, is that at a certain point you run out of these kinds of really tremendous discoveries, and you have to go on to smaller pursuits.
It's hard to imagine something that crisp and groundbreaking coming together now. Where Einstein, he was the perfect prepared mind, and then all these sort of different thought beams kind of, coming in from all directions, because these things were really in the air, and everyone was talking about them and worrying about them. And, Peter Gallison, this historian at Harvard, has traced some of Einstein's inspiration for special relativity to being a patent clerk and getting these patents coming across his desk for ways of synchronizing clocks. And, this gets you thinking about how space is related to time when you're trying to, get the trains to run on time in Europe. And all these things coming together in, someone who was prepared to do something with it and make this great leap. And, what a leap it was. But now things come very slowly and incrementally.
Yeah, speaking of which, I think this is a good place to segue into a discussion of the Large Hadron Collider, which is now the most powerful instrument for physics in the world.
Yeah, and the most complicated thing that people have ever built, I think, is how some people are describing it.
Right. So I guess...
did you catch the NPR, David Kestenbaum, had a couple of really good reports on that.
Yeah, I did. Those were really interesting. He interviewed a guy whom I interviewed when I was there. God, I guess it must have been 13 years ago or so. I did a big article for Scientific American on the future of particle physics, and I went to CERN, the big laboratory in Switzerland where the Large Hadron Collider is based. And there was this guy there, let's see, his name is Alvaro Darujala, a Spanish-born physicist, and they describe him as very world-weary and kind of depressed over the state of physics. And that's just how he was when I visited him 15 years ago at CERN. And it sounds as though things haven't improved much, although now at least they have the prospect of some really new experimental findings when this gigantic particle accelerator goes online. I guess next fall, is it? Is that what the new date is?
Yeah, it's one of these things where the date keeps getting pushed back, and I think lately they're saying that, they're hoping by fall that maybe they can power it up and, kind of put it through some tests. Like run it through its diagnostics, like when you plug in your new cordless phone and it blinks and goes through these cycles. But I don't think they're expecting to gather any data that soon. I guess we should probably talk a little bit about, what the LHC is, other than, that it's this huge particle accelerator and, what they think they're going to do with it.
Well, I get, so the course of modern particle physics has been basically determined by these gigantic machines that they built. They try to generate higher and higher energies in these collisions of particles to break them into smaller particles and find the basic fundamental elements of nature. So this is how we discovered quarks, which are the basic particles that protons and neutrons are made of, and neutrinos, and the particles that mediate the weak nuclear force and the strong nuclear force. And so the hope is that so now we've got this whole array of different particles, and these are all described by what's called the standard model of particle physics. And the hope is, it's all very kind of complicated and jury-rigged at this point, and the hope is that by generating higher energy collisions and breaking these particles into smaller constituents, they can find some underlying fundamental particles and forces that are simpler and more elegant in describing all of nature, basically.
Ah, well put.
So the question is whether this will happen. There's been a period of about 30 years now in particle physics since they've really had any dramatic findings coming out of particle physics, the kind that lead to Nobel Prizes.
Yeah, it's really just been kind of cleaning up details, right? Like they discovered or confirmed the existence of something called the top quark, one of the different varieties of quarks, and that was a huge thing, but that was sometime, early 90s?
It was quite a while ago, and in a way that's disappointing because It's just filling in this detail of the standard model. It's not, I mean, what...
Crossing I's, dotting T's.
Yeah, so scientists are sometimes described as being really stuffy and conservative and authoritarian and hate surprises and change. And I mean, you and I know that what all scientists are desperate for, especially in physics these days, is surprise and change. And the problem with physics now is that the experimental findings have, for decades now, just been confirming what the theories have already told them, instead of giving them, instead of giving them really exciting new, surprising insights into nature on the order of relativity and quantum mechanics and those sorts of things.
Yeah, and it's kind of an interesting ambiguity, because on one hand, there's satisfaction in confirming the theory, but then since they know the theory, the standard model doesn't explain everything, like it doesn't, they can't figure out a way to combine it with Einstein's general relativity, so you have gravity and everything in one theory, just like Einstein was trying to do, right?
Yeah.
But to do that, they need more data, and then the most powerful accelerators we have aren't showing them the particles that they predict that they need to extend the theory, so they're going to higher and higher energies. And I was struck by, at the end of one of the NPR radio pieces, maybe it was that same scientist, the world-weary one you were talking about, was saying that, the best thing would be if we didn't find anything.
Right.
Because, that would show that all of our theories were wrong, and, then we'd have to start over, and maybe it would, push physics in a new direction. But it's hard for me to believe that many people really would be really excited if they didn't find anything.
I wouldn't think that would be very good for physics at all. This thing cost $8 billion. They better find something. So I guess what they keep talking... Oh, first of all, let me back up and say, the last time we spoke, we talked about string theory, which is this attempt to unify quantum mechanics and relativity. It's about almost 30 years old now, and people have been excited on and off about it for a long time. It's getting a lot of criticism lately because it doesn't. It's very hard to understand how it can really be tested, let alone confirmed. And I just wanted to point out that the Large Hadron Collider, this accelerator that we're talking about in Switzerland, is about, as I recall, 15 orders of magnitude too small to reach the kinds of energies and small distance scales to have a really good test of superstring theory and some of these other so-called quantum gravity or unified theories.
Yeah, so in other words, superstrings are so tiny that to smash together particles and break out pieces that small, you'd need an accelerator the size... Sometimes you hear an accelerator the size of the solar system, or...
The Milky Way. The
Milky Way. Yeah, which obviously isn't going to happen, but of course you can use the universe itself maybe as an accelerator and, find two colliding galaxies or something. But that hasn't really borne out either. But that's what's...
Well, I was just going to.
So they can't, I'm sorry.
Well, I was going to bring up the Higgs boson. I guess if we're talking about what the LHC might accomplish.
Yeah. What might they find?
Well, the Higgs boson seems to be what they talk about. Again, this would be sort of the keystone of the standard model. It's something that explains how particles acquire mass. I've never really understood how it works in detail, but people have been talking about this Higgs boson particle for decades now, and if that is the, I guess, most likely really big quarry that the LHC could find.
Yeah, the way I think of it is it's this particle that interacts with the other particles in such a way that it gives them their different masses, because this is one of the big mysteries now, like why is the electron, 1,800 times lighter than the proton or something like that. And
right.
The proton and the neutron are almost exactly, but not quite the same mass. And if you can come up with this kind of field that sort of, I've heard it described as this kind of sticky, gluey, invisible field, and it interacts with particles and drags them back to certain to different amounts. I guess it has a different stickiness for different kinds of particles, and this results in the particles having a different mass. So, pretty big hole in physics that we don't know where mass comes from, and if they find evidence of this particle, that would be a huge thing.
Maybe that will be it for physics, though. There's sort of this interesting social dimension to physics of this kind, where you've got these gigantic machines which require hundreds or even thousands of technicians and physicists to work to build them and to work on them and maintain them and interpret the results. And you get these papers where the whole front page is just taken up by listing all the names of the people who worked on the experiment.
Hundreds.
And then, as we've been saying, maybe you'll find nothing at all, or maybe it will be just confirming some detail of this pre-existing theory. Why would a really smart, ambitious scientist want to do this? Why would anybody want to be a particle physicist nowadays?
Well, but I think, that's not what they want to do. A lot of times what happens is they'll do an experiment like, taking the accelerator at Fermilab and running it as high a power as they can and thinking, well, just maybe they will find the Higgs boson. And, of course, when they didn't, then you write a paper proving that the Higgs boson has to be at least a certain mass or size because we couldn't find it in the accelerator. So, they still kind of assume the particle's there, but then they just need a bigger accelerator. But I think there's always, though, this hope for surprises. Like even with the old data from the Fermilab accelerator a few years ago, they have all this stuff on computer tapes, these terabytes of data, and they were coming up with computer programs that would go through and sift that to look for evidence of little miniature black holes being formed in the collision of these particles. And there's various theories that say if you find these miniature black holes, first the theories say that they won't swallow the whole universe. So, we're assured that
what about the Earth?
Not
what
even
about Switzerland?
In fact, nothing. In fact, not even a proton. Apparently, we're assured they'll disappear immediately. But the cool thing is, if they find these things, according to some theories, they're gateways to another dimension. So
that sounds pretty cool.
They didn't find them, though, of course. But maybe they will, at the LHC.
I just have to tell you a quick story about something that happened at Scientific American about 10 years ago, or whenever it was that the Unabomber released his manifesto, early 90s, I guess that was. There was this little part of it where he described a story that had appeared in Scientific American. It was one of these sort of smart-ass things that we science writers write all the time. It was about this kind of tongue-in-cheek prediction by some people at Brookhaven, another big physics lab on Long Island, that one of their experiments might generate a mini black hole and suck the Earth into it. Do you remember that?
Oh, yeah, right. It was a big public relations problem.
Right. So, we thought of it as a joke. I thought of it as a joke. The guy at Scientific American, this friend of mine who wrote the article, he thought of it as a joke, and he wrote the article in that tone. The Unabomber was really upset. This was, to him, an example of this scientific hubris that drove him crazy and led him to blow people up. So he mentioned this in his manifesto rant, and as a result, the FBI came to our offices and told us that we had to start monitoring all our mail because they thought that the Unabomber might send one of his bombs to us.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah, well, that was a wonderful history. My only regret was that I hadn't written that article, so I didn't get my name mentioned in the Unabomber manifesto. Like
that would have, your career would have been made. I had kind of the not nearly as dramatic an experience with that same story, which I wrote something for the New York Times about that, and except there, people at Brookhaven were upset because I was kind of, making light of it, and they felt like I hadn't, fully, persuaded everyone that this was not going to happen, and which, actually that was the whole point of my story, was to kind of make fun of it, but it wasn't funny to them because it might mean they have to do an environmental impact study or something. Will this experiment destroy the universe? Well, back in the Manhattan Project, we mentioned Oppenheimer earlier, and here in New Mexico, the scientists were placing bets on whether, when they exploded the first atomic bomb down south of here at Trinity site, whether it would destroy the atmosphere. And
you know something? I talked to Hans Bethe about that. So Hans Bethe was involved in that episode. Right. Apparently, what he told me happened there was that Edward Teller, who was this brilliant Hungarian physicist who went on to help design the hydrogen bomb and became this really crazy pro-nuke person after the Manhattan Project. Ironically, during the Manhattan Project, he did this calculation that suggested that the heat of the explosion might ignite the Earth's atmosphere and basically incinerate all life on Earth. Yeah. So he was understandably concerned about this, and he came to Hans Bethe, who was head of the theoretical division of the Manhattan Project. He was Teller's boss to that extent. Mm-hmm. And Bethe said that he did this back-of-the-envelope calculation and determined that Teller's calculation was wrong, and no, the Earth would not be destroyed. So Bethe told me this, and I looked at him and I said, when the bomb went off, did you have any doubts about whether you might be wrong? And he just kind of looked at me and said, no, I did the calculation, and I knew it wouldn't happen. Like, absolutely sure of himself.
Boy. Well, I wish I could be that sure of my calculation.
Yeah. Well, if I had to put the world in someone's hands, Hans Bethe would be my choice. He was definitely one of the great physicists of all time. But listen, George.
Humanist too.
Yeah, definitely a great person in every way. There's something an issue I wanted to get into with all our talk about physics and the Higgs boson and what the LHC might or might not discover. These particles that are discovered in accelerators, whether it's quarks or neutrinos or even electrons, neutrons, protons, there's this debate among philosophers of science. Are these things really discovered, or are they, to a certain extent, invented? Are they kind of constructions of our imagination that we impose on experimental data? Yeah. My sense, George, is that you are more in the invention camp. That was the message that I got out of your book, Fire in the Mind. So I just wonder how you feel about that now.
I remember when that book came out and you and I were doing Science Friday, the NPR show with Ira Flatow.
Yeah.
And at some point you asked me point blank if I believed in the electron. Which I thought was, which I kind of do. And see, what bothers me about this, and I kind of spent a good deal of Fire in the Mind grappling with this, because it's not that I necessarily come down on invention versus discovery, but it really constantly puzzles me. For example, in these accelerators like the LHC or Fermilab, when two particles collide, then they put out this debris, and the debris flies out in certain patterns, and they measure energy, and they do this imagery. But what it comes down to is the only thing that we as humans can really detect are photons, which are particles of light, which we see all the time, or particles of any kind of electromagnetism. We can detect, obviously, radio waves because we're using them right now, or electrons, because we can feel electrons when, if you pull a wool sweater off over your head, you can actually hear the crackling of electricity. So electrons and photons are the only thing we interact with directly. That's really the interface we have to reality. So if you do something like produce the top quark in an accelerator, what this means is you produce a particle, and particle A, this mysterious particle that's in the theories, it could be the Higgs boson, it could be, they have things called squarks and all these supersymmetric particles. Don't need to get into that, but all these esoteric particles, and they exist in the theory mathematically, and then the theory says that this particle A will break down and maybe make a couple of particle B and C, and they'll spin around this way, and then this will break down into another level. And then finally, after a certain number of layers, you get electrons and photons of certain energies and doing certain things, and you detect those with your detectors, and then you go back and infer all of this other stuff. So, it's very...
Where does that leave us?
Yeah, I mean, you're embedded in this. I recently, after years of writing about all this stuff lately, I just really wanted to start trying to do some of these experiments myself, which was part of this 10 Most Beautiful Experiments book that I just finished writing. And
right.
I wanted to convince myself that the electron really existed. Basically, to answer
you wanted
the
to convince. So you don't want to be a postmodernist. You want to be a naive realist like me.
I pulled in both. To me, it's a subtle interaction, and with electrons, actually, you can't see this, which is one of the wonderfully odd things about these conversations. But I have over here. This is kind of I have a small particle accelerator. It's not exactly what it is, but it is something. It's a big glass tube, and if you hook it up to a high voltage, it'll shoot out a beam of electrons, and they hit the edge of the tube, and then there are these big copper coils around here, and you hook that to another voltage source, and you turn up the voltage in the coils, and it gets to just the point where the magnetic field is strong enough that it bends the beam of electrons into a perfect circle.
Cool.
This was an experiment that J.J. Thomson, this great British physicist, did at the Cavendish Laboratories in Cambridge, England, around the turn of the century.
Where do you get this apparatus?
On eBay.
Of course.
Yeah, it's a beautiful piece of equipment. It's on a nice wooden base, and I got this, and then I got these high voltage power supplies, and I hooked it up, and I turned out the lights, and I creeped up the voltage, and then got the circle. And then you measure the radius of the circle. You measure the amount of current flowing through the coils. You measure the voltage on the plates inside this big vacuum tube that's accelerating the beam of electrons. And you plug all of this into this formula, and you can calculate what they call the charge to mass ratio of the electron. And basically, it's pretty good evidence that electricity consists of matter that's negatively charged. And it was like the first step to discovering the electron. So I did the calculations, and I actually got the right number of zeros. I got the right order of magnitude.
That's awesome.
Twice, I was off by a factor of 2, but,
that's
just to get
close
the right
enough.
number of zeros. Okay, but now the next step is the milk and oil drop experiment, and there I failed utterly, so...
Well, at least you're trying. I mean, I'm just totally an armchair scientist. I read about other people's experiments. I would never have the ambition to do what you just did, so I really applaud that. But I mean, having done this,
appreciate how hard this stuff is. And,
yeah.
The people. One thing I finally concluded with the Millikan. This is actually, I have a Millikan apparatus, and there's like 2 little brass plates, and like the little oil drops fall down there, and they have electrical charges, and you vary the voltage. It's, we won't get into it now, but just the experiment to me was so difficult, and people do it in college physics classes, amazingly to me, but I realized that for me to do the Millikan oil drop experiment would be equivalent to me learning how to play the violin.
Pretty daunting.
So I have great respect for these people.
Well, so where, I'm sorry I have to keep coming back to this, but I really am curious. Where do you come out? Well, let me just tell you where I come out. So, we've talked about this book, The End of Science, that I wrote. The basic premise of my book was that there are these discoveries, not inventions, that science makes. Certain parts of science or certain theories, I think, clearly are inventions. A really good example would be something like psychoanalysis, which I think is obviously to a very significant degree a figment of Freud's imagination and a product of his particular cultural context and so forth. On the other hand,
it's not really a scientific theory in the sense that commonly used, do you think?
Certainly not in the same sense
or an
that
ideology.
Yeah, and it's not, and this is my point, is that it's not a theory, it's not a discovery in the same sense that the genetic code is, or evolution is, or the Big Bang Theory, or electrons, or electromagnetism, gravity, all these sorts of things. So I see those as discoveries in the same sense as the discovery of continents and oceans and that sort of thing. These are real features of nature, and we create this foundation of knowledge on these great discoveries, and it's at some point you just reach, given the limits that you have, you reach the end of those sorts of really important discoveries. But I'm just astonished at how many science journalists and obviously philosophers of science and scientists themselves have this view that I call postmodernist. Now, the funny thing about postmodernism, and I guess I should define it quickly, I think of postmodernists as basically holding the view that our knowledge is constructed, it's invented. They don't really believe in discovery in the same sense that I do. And I'm just astonished at how many people hold that view.
Well, I think it's more subtle than that. To me, obviously discovering America is one thing. You're going in this boat and you find something you didn't know was there before, even though there are all these people living there that discovered it already.
Right.
When they were born, I guess, or wake up every morning. But, something like the electron even. Yes, I believe in the electron, but, the electron, it's not this little tiny particle. It's this strange quantum thing in which you can't, it's somewhat like a particle, somewhat like a wave. And the fact is that, our brains, which evolved in, the world in order to survive, don't necessarily have the means of understanding what an electron is. So the best we can do is kind of triangulate from these different trajectories and say it's sort of like a wave, it's sort of like a particle. So to me, the electron, it's an intersection between the human brain and the physical world out there. And it's one of the pieces of the world as we're able to parse it because of the structure of our brains. And what fascinates me is if we ever do meet up with an alien civilization that has science, if they would carve up the world the same way that we do or not, or if they might have a completely commensurate, equivalent physics with entirely different concepts and laws that maps onto ours, but and explains the world just as well, or maybe better.
Edward Witten, the great superstring guru, once told me that he was absolutely certain that the advanced civilizations elsewhere in the universe, he was certain that there were such civilizations out there, and that inevitably some of them would be ahead of us in their science. And he said he was absolutely certain that they would also have discovered superstring theory as the basic theory of reality.
Because the theory is so beautiful, they say.
Right.
Yeah, but it really comes down to philosophically whether you're a Platonist. And a Platonist believes there's this pre-existing truth and that mathematics is part of the deep structure of the universe, or if you're an Aristotelian and you kind of believe that we humans, the best we can do is make models of something that's always going to be just at least slightly bigger than our comprehension. And what a metaphor I like is, the Platonists are like they see science as miners digging ore, and they find these veins of gold. And then the Aristotelians are postmodernists, I guess. And I'm not really using the term Aristotelian accurately, I don't think. But say the postmodernists look at science as more like improvisational jazz. And
nice.
And it's obviously not an entire, it's an invention, but it's an invention that's constrained by reality because we use it to make predictions and tests it. So to me, it's just this interesting tension, this kind of pull in these two directions that, the only way you can answer that question is to jump out of the system and take some godlike view of the universe, and since we're stuck in the system we're trying to describe, we'll always have these wonderful puzzles.
Well, I guess the way I look at it is I think you can just look at the history of certain fields and distinguish between how successfully they achieve some kind of successful theory to explain all the puzzles that are in front of them. So you look at something like nuclear physics, and over the first half of the 20th century, there was this remarkable convergence of theoretical convergence on a single model for explaining all these phenomena that were coming out of experiments and in astrophysics and so forth. And basically, physicists agree on what's going on in the nucleus of atoms and molecules and so forth. Then you look at, and so I think in that case, of course, you can imagine that the nomenclature and certain aspects of the theory could be changed and are contingent to a certain extent on history. But there's this sort of core of discovery there compared to a field like psychology, which is just lurching from one faddish paradigm to another. So you've got psychoanalysis at the beginning of the 20th century, then you've got behaviorism, then you've got cognitive science, and it's just one fad after another, and the paradigms just sort of are recycled. They're never really replaced once and for all.
It's not that bad, is it?
Oh, it's worse.
To me, cognitive, the leap, going from B.F. Skinner's behaviorism and saying that the only thing psychology can talk about is behavior, what's happening on the outside, and then the leap from that to the current cognitive science, where you come up with these models of what's actually happening in the mind. Like there's a scientist, Stephen Kozlin, who does work with visual imagery and timing how long it takes someone to say visualize some three-dimensional object and then rotate it in their mind. And that to me is that's science. It's not just
science. It's progress of a kind. But what? So now I guess we just made a segue from physics to neuroscience. The problem with neuroscience, it's obviously getting somewhere, but the question is where. It's actually harder to imagine how you would have some kind of grand unified theory of the brain and mind at this point than it was 100 years ago. So Freud could have this very successful theory with both, it was just a theory, but also a therapy of the mind and all its disorders. And it was successful in part because there was so little hard data to contradict him. Nowadays, we've got just a tremendous amount of data coming from all these brain scans, all these different experiments we can do on our brains and minds, and there is no unified theory to make sense of it all.
Neuroscience, it's a data-rich, theory-poor, and it's probably the hardest of all the sciences in that regard.
Yes.
Even in the 19th century, before anyone knew anything about subatomic particles and certainly nothing about superstrings and Higgs bosons, I think a physicist in that time, Kelvin or someone, could imagine what a theory of matter would be like, or a theory of matter and energy, just in the most general, vague sense. They could have a feel of what a theory might be like, but it's impossible, I think, to imagine what a theory of consciousness would be like, or a theory of how subjective experience arises from electrochemical interactions in the brain. But
what's interesting is that physicists are trying to get into this game of consciousness studies. So you've got Roger Penrose, who is this great British physicist who's done a lot of work in trying to understand gravity and extend relativity, and he's got his own twist on a unified theory of physics. Francis Crick, who helped to decode the double helix, started his career as a physicist, and for the last couple of decades before he died, he was a leader in trying to understand consciousness in terms of of neural events.
Yeah, and he found some interesting things, right?
He did find some interesting things.
Yeah,
well, you know, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, didn't he find like there's a certain frequency? Is it the gamma?
40 hertz oscillations.
Yeah, and then it sort of links together possibly different parts of your brain into like a whole, kind of gestalt or something.
That's right. That's one of the dozens or scores or hundreds of theories of consciousness that are floating around out there now. But, maybe at this point we should, so we don't have that much time left, we should skip to another topic. At least it's in biology. Mm-hmm. You saw the Science Times issue this week, this last Tuesday.
Oh, the special sex issue.
Yes, the sex issue.
Yeah, right.
Right.
Yeah. You had mentioned that you thought maybe it was left over from Valentine's Day or something.
Yeah,
so make all their deadlines.
That's right. So I was wondering why it came out on April 10th of all days, and I thought that I remember they had some Natalie Angiers, one of their writers, one of my favorite science journalists. She had an essay on sex and love back on Valentine's Day, but she's got another big piece in this issue, as does Nicholas Wade.
Yeah.
And so they're reviewing all this recent research on the biology of sexual desire, and it's sort of interesting how Wade and Angier are paired off here, because I think of Nicholas Wade, and tell me if I'm being fair or not, I think of him as kind of the genetic determinist of the New York Times science section, whereas Natalie Angier is much more into the complexities of biology.
Right,
She's
right.
definitely
she
not
really
a reductionist.
bristles. Yeah. Natalie really bristles at the suggestion that it's like psychobiology, for example, and psychogenetics
and evolutionary psychology.
That's the word I'm trying. The phrase I'm trying to grab.
Yeah,
evolutionary psychology. Yeah, she really bristles at that. Well, I think you're right. I mean, that's a little cartoonish, but and then Nicholas is this very kind of serious, very staid and reserved, both in his writing and his just the way he is, and he's one of the really great science writers. And then Natalie has just a very, very opposite style. So it is interesting that they sort of oppose the yin and yang of science writers.
Well, let me just read from the beginning of Wade's piece, because I was bristling a little bit myself at this. So he says, when it comes to the matter of desire, evolution leaves little to chance. Human sexual behavior is not a free-form performance, but is guided at every turn by genetic programs. Desire between the sexes is not a matter of choice. And then he sort of goes on in this vein, and he actually presents a lot of interesting findings, as does Natalie Angier. But one of the things that bothers me about Wade's discussion in this article, and actually to a certain extent this creeps into Angier's piece too. First of all, they talk about straight sex versus gay sex. And, they present it as this kind of dichotomy that characterizes sex in general. And my problem is that I think that's a false dichotomy. For example, two of my best friends are, they've been married now for 10 years. They dated for about 5 years before that. And before they met each other and fell in love, each of them had been involved in a gay relationship for years and considered themselves gay. And then they met each other, and their personalities, I mean, this is one of my favorite couples. These people are just made for each other because their personalities mesh so well.
Yeah,
so that transcended...
That transcended the...
Yes.
Well, I remember having a conversation with Natalie about that sort of thing once, and just saying that, my feeling was that, obviously everything, our mind comes from the brain. There's no separate, mind floating out there that, falls in love with some separate mind that's not also rooted in another brain. So obviously it's all biological, and obviously it's all rooted in the genes. But at the same time, there's a point where the brain, the human brain particularly, develops a certain complexity, and it becomes, like a very powerful computer, and a very powerful computer can simulate basically anything. So there's almost kind of a decoupling between this ability to, have things in your mind that, they arise out of the brain, but they're not necessarily tightly constrained by it.
And our brains are so, this is really just another battle of the age-old war of nature versus nurture, which really predominates in explaining human nature. And I think Nick Wade is clearly on the nature side. He's very enamored of genetic explanations of human behavior, but it seems to me that we keep learning that it's this very complex interaction. And if you just look at the array of human behavior and human sexuality in particular, just locally in New York City, and especially if you look around the world, the diversity is just incredible. The example... Sorry, go ahead.
Well, that doesn't necessarily argue against it being biologically determined. It has to be biologically determined, but as you say, there's no, it's not nature or nurture, but it's this complex interaction. So, we arise out of nature, we're biological creatures, and part of our biological apparatus includes being able to, make these sounds in the air and communicate with language with some other biological creature. So that's all part of it, and then that sort of kind of bootstraps it up to this, higher level where you have, minds seeming to interact directly with minds, but it's all really biological, but there's nothing horribly constraining or depressing about that.
I guess it's not, of course, everything ultimately is mediated by biology. I guess I'm more, as you were saying before, I think it comes down to how complex you think things are. So I was just saying, I don't think that the dichotomy of straight versus gay really does justice to human sexuality. Right. The example I keep thinking of, it must have been 10 years ago or so, I read an article. I always get Vanity Fair for some reason when I'm traveling on an airplane. And I never read it any other time, but I love reading it when I've got a long flight. And there was an article in Vanity Fair that I read a while back. The reporter went to a convention of people who have a sexual obsession with plush toys. So these are stuffed animals with really soft fur. Have you ever heard of this?
No, I haven't.
Well, I like to think that I can imagine every sort of human perversion and sexual possibility all on my own. And so I'm always sort of disappointed when I discover something that absolutely had never occurred to me.
Yeah,
and,
that's what's so wonderful about life.
But these are people who, and there are lots of them apparently, enough that they had a convention in Las Vegas. These are people who like to dress up in giant bunny suits or bear suits or whatever and have sex with other people in these suits, or they just they don't dress up themselves, but they just take an animal with, no person in it and they have sex with that thing. So will biology are we going to find the gene for plush toy desire someday?
But all you need to do is find the genes that help you develop a brain that can then, Richard Dawkins, the biologist, he talks about memes, the equivalent of genes. So brains develop, and genes can explain how brains develop. And, at least they can show the basic blueprint for how brains develop, and then it's the body, not just the genes, but interacting with the physical environment and the environment inside the skull as the little connections are made. So you can use genes to come up with a biological expression of how the brain arises, and then once the brain arises, it has this ability to trade in memes, memes being these little snippets of cultural information. So you have all these brains exchanging memes like this weird thing with the bunny suits, and it'd be silly to look for a gene for the bunny suits, but it all still does come down to genetics and biology. But
I guess it depends on how simple you think the chain of causation is going to be. So you probably remember back in 1993, Science magazine published this paper by a group led by Dean Hamer, who is a really prominent geneticist at the National Cancer Institute, claiming to have discovered a gene associated with male homosexuality. So, of course, this became known as the gay gene, and Hamer went on to get a big book contract and became very famous and made a lot of money off this claim.
There was a God gene, too, right?
Pardon me?
There was a God gene, too, the gene that makes you believe in God. And,
That's right. He discovered the God gene. It was on the front page of Time magazine a couple of years ago. He got a book contract for that, too. The gay gene doesn't exist, at least the one that Hamer discovered. Several other groups have tried to corroborate his findings, and they failed. So that gigantic claim that a lot of people still believe in was just false. And there's been this whole string of claims similar to that. The gene, there have been claims of a gene for high intelligence, a gene for gambling compulsion. I mean, you name it. There's been a gene that's supposedly discovered that's correlated with this type of behavior, and this field just has a terrible track record. I mean, none of these genes have been, none of these findings have held up under scrutiny. So again, my feeling is that, yes, of course, everything has to be mediated by genes to a certain extent, plus experience, just that the causation is going to be tremendously complex, much more than...
You have several genes interacting, and once you have even 3 or 4 genes interacting, it's like, having a piano keyboard, and you can play all these chords and different combinations of musical proteins and get all sorts of complex structures. So, just because there isn't a gene for a specific trait, obviously doesn't mean it's not genetic. And
that's right.
Yeah.
That's all I want people to realize.
But sometimes, I don't know, do you think a lot of the scientists really believe they found the gene for this or that, or if it's just how it comes out in the simplifications in the press?
No, I've been covering this since I did this big article for Scientific American on this whole trend of discovering, in behavioral genetics, it's called, associating very complex behaviors like homosexuality or certain disorders like alcoholism or schizophrenia with single genes. And the scientists themselves were making these claims, like Dean Hamer made these claims.
He did write the book,
That's right. And other scientists also made claims that were very simplistic and turned out not to hold up over time. And then I've got to tell you, the New York Times published some terrible articles in the late 80s and early 90s repeating some of these claims. I can remember a page 1 story on the so-called alcoholism gene that the New York Times published, which turned out to be...
You don't think the story had all the usual qualifications? I know the stuff that Nicholas Wade does is very careful. And you have almost this boilerplate obligatory paragraph, scientists caution that it's oversimplistic to say that there is a gene for any one trait.
The caveats tend to be, I'm talking about this period about 15 years ago now, but even in some of the recent coverage, the New York Times has gotten a lot more careful. But as I said, the Time magazine had this cover story on the God gene, a gene supposedly associated with religious belief. Just a couple of years ago, it was an incredibly superficial, credulous treatment of this really just BS finding from Dean Hamer. So anyway, this is just another one of my pet peeves.
I can tell.
Sorry for that rant.
No, you're right, though. I mean, it's ridiculously simplified, and something that Natalie Angier points out a lot is, and also this biologist Richard Lewontin, is that his?
Yes, at Harvard.
Sure you have genes, but these genes aren't. They don't exist in isolation from the rest of the physical world, and they're basically, eliciting the production of these proteins, and you're getting feedback from the environment, and so, the same combination of genes will come up with a different structure, you know, in a different climate, and you know, so it's just much more interesting than, you know, this ridiculous idea that you have a, you know, a gene for intelligence, or a gene for musical ability, or a gene for writing.
Oh, I like to say that we were talking about particle physics earlier. Now we're talking about the human mind. Particle physics is a child's game compared to the study of the human brain and the human mind. The complexity, I mean, it's often said that the human brain is the most complex object known to science. And that is
it's
certainly...
the human brain that's making that claim.
That's right.
That was Tom Robbins, I think.
That's right. Maybe it's narcissism, but I think it's borne out by the record of the fields that attempt to explain us to ourselves.
Well, and it's one of the reasons why, you know, it's been cited as, you know, why in physics it tends to be a young person's game. And, you know, Einstein was very young, and when he came up with relativity in his 20s, and the young quantum physicists like Werner Heisenberg and Wolfgang Pauli, you know, they were these kids in their early 20s doing this stuff, because, you know, one thing that Murray Gell-Mann, the great particle physicist, once told me was that, you know, really, once you learn a few kind of mathematical tools and a few theories, if you're really smart and you can manipulate these equations and just know how to think about physics, you can come up with these new discoveries. Or at least you could back in the golden days. But with something like neuroscience or the biological sciences, there aren't any of these neat, crisp theories and mathematical tools, and therefore you have to accumulate a lot of wisdom and knowledge over years and years, and so you tend to see the discoveries coming from older scientists.
You know, Noam Chomsky, the great linguist up at MIT, once told me that we will always learn more about ourselves from novels than we will from science. Speaking of which, I didn't even think of this as a segue, but it works. You know, we've already gone. We've already been rattling on here for an hour now, so maybe we should close by mentioning the sad passing of an author who I guess we both really enjoyed when we were younger, Kurt Vonnegut.
Yeah. I mean, he was 84, right?
84. I guess he banged his head.
I don't know. That really affected me for some reason, because it just brought back all these memories of, you know, first discovering him in college and reading Slaughterhouse-Five and about, Billy Pilgrim gets unstuck in time, and and the chronosynclastic infundibulum. And
wow, that's good. Your memory is better than mine is.
Well, actually, I got that from Denisha Smith's wonderful obit.
It was a great obit. You know, first of all, it made me want to I don't think I have any Vonnegut novels still with me. You know, I was reading them, 30, 40 years ago.
Yeah, I beat up old paperbacks.
Yeah.
You know, cost $1.95 new.
Yeah, I'm sure there's going to be a run on them now, but so I sort of wanted to go back and reread Cat's Cradle and Slaughterhouse-Five and some of my favorites of his, but not only for myself, but I've got a 13-year-old son, and I think he would love Kurt Vonnegut. You know, that sort of kind, wise sense of the absurdity of life.
Sort of this kindly cynicism.
Yeah. Sort of Einsteinian in his
he was kind
wisdom.
of Einsteinian. And, you know, his brother, Bernard Vonnegut, we should talk about this in another conversation, but he was one of the great lightning researchers.
Is that right? I didn't know that.
Yeah, and it turns out that there's all kinds of fundamental things about lightning that aren't understood yet in science.
Well, maybe that will be the next frontier of science. It will emerge from a study of something as mundane as lightning.
If
the LHC doesn't work out.
Lightning. Yeah, because, you know, there's actually a place in New Mexico where the scientists get up in the mountains and they're in this metal sort of hut, and then lightning bolts strike the hut while they're in there, and obviously the interior is insulated from the outside, and they measure the effects of these huge electromagnetic fields. And, yeah, it'd be a cool thing to talk about.
Oh, that sounds like that sounds like fun science. Just one more thing. I wonder if you have thought about the influence of science fiction on people's expectations of science, because that's something that I have thought about a little bit. In fact, I once coined a term called the Star Trek effect to refer to the expectation that people have. I mean, we from the time we were infants. And this is even more true of my kids than it was of myself, because I don't think I started watching TV. We didn't get a TV until I was maybe 7 or 8, whereas our kids were watching basically when they were, starting when they were a couple of days old. But we're all immersed in all these science fiction fantasies of the future with warp drive spaceships and time travel and genetically modified superhumans and intelligent robots, and I think people, and even very sophisticated people, scientists and philosophers and historians of science, have this almost unconscious expectation that these things are going to happen. We're going to have warp drive spaceships at some point in the future. We're going to travel to other galaxies and meet aliens from other civilizations.
Yeah, but it's great to think that. I mean, to me, it's just, I'm a big Battlestar Galactica fan.
Oh, really?
Yeah, to me, it just, it generates this excitement among the public, and even if they get some, kind of twisted ideas about science, like, there's some really, interesting things about quantum mechanics and Star Trek that are, pretty fringy, but it just, helps develop this public enthusiasm for science, maybe, and plus it's just good fun.
I'm such a spoil sport that I feel compelled to point out that most of these things are actually maybe not ruled out by what we already know scientifically, but are at least rendered highly implausible. So, for example, if you believe the special theory of relativity, you don't really believe in warp drive spaceships that can go, 8 or 10 times the speed of light. You don't believe in time travel. And, when I look at the history of genetics and the complexity of genetics that we've just been talking about, it makes it hard to believe in some of these scenarios involving immortality and superhuman creatures and so forth. And as far as extraterrestrials, man, I wish we could discover them. I wish they'd land on the Earth tomorrow. But we've been looking for quite a while now, and there's really no sign that anything is out there.
Oh, well. I mean, that's just the sort of prediction that could, like tomorrow something could appear. It's just, to me, the science fiction is just a wonderful tribute to the human imagination, which is, the same thing I'd say about science, and it's just that with science it's more constrained.
Let's end on that upbeat note. Instead of my downbeat note.
Okay. If you wouldn't mind, there was a really nice short poem by Kurt Vonnegut that Denisha Smith ended her obit with.
Oh, please read it.
Yeah. I hadn't heard it before, and it really moved me. When the last living thing has died on account of us, how poetical it would be if Earth could say, in a voice floating up perhaps from the floor of the Grand Canyon, "It is done. People did not like it here."
Wait a minute, that didn't sound
That's a down note. Okay.
That's okay. I can't do better than that.
There's actually a good addendum to this. There was a correction to her story, and it was one of these wonderful New York Times corrections. It's a real classic. The surname of a character who appears in the novel Breakfast of Champions or Goodbye Monday was misspelled. It is Phil Boyd Studge, not Sludge.
That's great. Well, I'm glad we got that straightened out.
Yeah. It's good talking to you, John.
Yeah, thanks a lot, George.
Okay, bye.